Welcome to this webinar. We'll just wait a few moments until everyone's joined. So if you could just hang fire a second, that'd be great. So if you want to just, like yesterday, make yourself aware of the chat option, and if you want to fill in and where you're from, that'll be great. That'll be good to know. But for everyone that's joined, welcome to the Graze Debate 2, session 2. This is the second night of 4 that we've got running on the Graze Debate. You know, obviously, ideally, we'd love to be doing this in person, but this is the best we can do just now. But thanks for joining us. I see there's 64 people joined us so far. We had 97 yesterday, so it'll be good to see as many that come back, or if this is your first time, that you'll benefit from what's going to be said. So the theme of the Graze Debate 2 is how to begin rotational grazing, and our 3 fantastic farmers gave their tips and tricks yesterday and advice on getting started. And we now are come to the session where the consultants are looking at the kind of the setting up of that, and that's what we're going to talk about today. This whole Graze Debate is a project that's funded through the University Innovation Fund from the Scottish Funding Council. So just thought we'd just very quickly just recap from yesterday. We had Kalina Humphrey open up talking about her grazing system, and she'd entitled her PowerPoint Grazing at Grainston. So I thought, in keeping with alliteration, we'd have Lays at Leamington and Covers at Croglan, and so we had James Drummond too, and Thomas Stobart talk through their different systems. And it was great to see the enthusiasm and the passion and what drove them to make the changes, and the advice they gave thereafter. So I just took down 3 simple things, take-home messages from what these guys and girls said. And Kalina made the point of back in 2014 when she was getting started about, you know, how important it was being in that grazing group, seeking advice, getting a mentor, you know, contacting the right people to get started. And I think also with this week being kind of Good to Talk week, you know, farm mental health week, it's important also to talk. And whilst this is a different context, you know, it's professional advice, it's still with everything, it's good to speak to people outside of your family and neighbours and get that help. But so James very passionately brought forward his system, and he mentioned about you don't need to make it complicated getting started to rotational grazing. Just start by mobbing your stock up and move them field to field, and you'll see the benefits, and you'll see the extra grass that you're growing. And Thomas mentioned that his techno grazing, and that was really interesting to see, and how he's splitting up the farm, but how important it is to have the right plan in place. You don't want to be splitting up the farm and causing yourself extra labour. So play to the strengths of your farm and seek advice there when setting it up. So just 3 things from them. Kalina doubled her lambs, sold off the farm. James had doubled livestock numbers. Thomas had also increased his numbers and switched to being more cattle orientated, and had slashed fertilizer and concentrates. And so it was really great to see how the business improved economically, and how they're growing more grass, but equally being sustainable in that too. And I've just got a quote there from the side by Tom yesterday saying that spending money on temporary electric fencing, it's the best money you can spend. And we're going to elaborate that on today, looking at the costings of these things. So just a bit of housekeeping. You probably are all familiar with using Zoom, but if you can direct all questions, please, through the Q&A tab, that would be great. And then we can just keep a track of them and have them answered. And then whilst the consultants in this case today are speaking, use the chat tab to have a chat amongst yourselves, or anything that's related to the PowerPoint slide at the time. and use that tab. That'll be the best way to field your thoughts there. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, which is Poppy Frater. It was going to be Daniel Stout, but Daniel was not able to make tonight, so Poppy's taking over his slides, and she'll just be sharing her screen just now, and we'll get started. But thank you very much for joining, and we hope you can stay for the full webinar. Thank you. Poppy, you're on mute just now, sorry.
Is that coming through?
Okay. It is indeed.
It is indeed. Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, unfortunately, my very much more knowledgeable, probably colleague Daniel Stout couldn't make it today. So you're stuck with me for 2 presentations rather than 1. But fear not, I have stolen some of his slides. And we have a tough act to follow. Yeah, thank you, Jack, for summarising. The farmers did a great job, and absolutely do get in touch with me. I've put my email in the chat if you'd like to get a recording from yesterday. As advisors, of course, there's no applicable sort of guide that we can give to you that you can just take away and put on your farm. You need to vary it according to your context, your needs. But what we can do is we can give a bit of a framework, and that's what I hope to deliver in this presentation. So it's a starting point, it's a framework. I'm sure there'll be farmers in the audience that are doing things very differently and successfully in that approach, but I'll give you this guide, and feel free to chat as you've adapted to suit your situation to what's worked well for you. And we touched on a lot of these yesterday's, the opportunities for rotational grazing, but it's important to put it into context as to what it means for your farm business. So we talk about the ability to increase grass grown and increase utilisation. So the two coming together equates to increased utilised grass on the farm, because that's what's important. You're not selling grass off the farm, you're selling grass within meat or milk or wool, as the case may be. So you capitalise on that additional grass utilised through increased output per hectare, as we heard from James and Kalina yesterday, and or with decreased inputs. The other opportunity is to maintain pasture quality through the season. Taking sort of finishing cattle, for instance, if they're set stocked, it's very normal for their growth rates to decline through the season, because that's a reflection of the quality of the pasture they're on. However, good rotational grazers can see over, in August, September time, they can see what a kilo a day in growth rates and above, and that's purely because they're maintaining pasture quality. So that, yeah. You can improve the allocation of late season and winter grazing. So this can equate to reduced winter feeding costs. You might end up having them outside a month later in the year with deferred grazing, or you might even have them on rotational grass throughout the winter, as James did with some of his flock. It might equate to more grass in the spring, which means less supplementation required, as we've heard. Tom reflected on how he barely uses any concentrates for his ewe flock at all. And we talked about how it improves the persistency of sown species. If you're giving animals this opportunity to select, if you think they're always selecting the sweeties in the pasture, they're always putting pressure on those good grasses. And if they're given opportunity to continually put pressure on those good grasses, then those good grasses are going to die out in the sward. So improves the persistency of sown species. So we capitalise that on less need for reseeding. And of course, pasture is competitive with any other feeds that you might bring onto the farm in terms of its quality. So we've got quite good services that you work with farmers to measure pasture quality through the year and also measure grass growth. So one example is Grass Check GB. And Tom is actually one of the GrazeCheck GB contributors. So just seeing here in May time last year, the quality of the grass, I mean, this is the key driver here, and I'll tell you a little bit more in a moment, but the quality of the grass in May was 12 ME as an average for the group that was submitting their grass samples, and crude protein above 20. So grass, absolutely, it's competitive with bought-in feeds. It's certainly cheaper than bought-in feeds. It's certainly cheaper than conserved grass. The challenge that we have is managing this variable grass growth curve. I mean, an ideal situation would be to have lots of stock in the summer and not many stock in the winter. And that way we are able to match supply and demand. Of course, it's not as easy in practice, but that's the ideal. I just thought I would share this graph with you. It's 3 or 4 years ago now, but this was a bit of a revelation to me. This was another program similar to GrazeCheck called Forage for Knowledge, run by AHDB Dairy. And again, they had a number of farmers sampling grass on a regular basis for energy, dry matter, crude protein. I'm not so concerned with the crude protein through the year. It's high, but protein is often in excess of demand. It's not often limiting. It's very, very rarely limiting at grazed grass. You can see the dry matter through the year. Again, it's not something I can control much. However, what was the revelation to me was the ability of these farmers to maintain the energy at around 11 to 12 ME at quite a constant good quality through the year. And that was a testament to their skill as graziers to keep on top of quality of the grass, keeping it green and leafy. And it just shows the power of management in terms of improving the grass quality. Which is great because energy drives performance. This is a graph taken from 400 Plus, which is a really good Beef and Lamb New Zealand document. And the premise is based on trying to achieve over 400 grams a day of growth rates in lambs from birth to sale, which is a very tricky thing to do. But one of the charts they showed in this is that with higher ME, you can expect better lamb performance. And of course, similar goes with cattle. And you can see what types of feeds. You can tell it's a New Zealand publication because there's very little mention of hard feed. But you can see ewe milk being often the highest quality food a lamb will have. You can see sort of mostly clover pasture will be in around the 11 to 12 ME mark. And this is where you could see James's great lamb growth rates. Because it's high energy and good quality pasture, that's when you're going to achieve the good live weight gains. What's notable here is actually as energy gets below 9, they start to go backwards. And all it takes is 50% of stem, dead or little clover in that pasture. So getting beyond that point to have a detrimental effect on animal performance. So the sort of issue with managing pasture is spring management is kind of pivotal to how the rest of the season might turn out. Okay, and this is because everything's happening at once. Grass is ready to shoot up quite quickly. But spring is one of the main times for tillering. So one of the ways that the grass plant reproduces is producing new tillers at the base of the plant, and which is very important for a nice dense base of this sward. And to encourage that process, we must allow grazing to allow sunlight to the base of the sward. And another area that spring management is influential to is clover. So keeping on top of the pasture in the spring and keeping it well managed is influential to the quality and clover content, which again is quality later on. So many of you may have heard the 3-leaf rule. And This kind of helps set the scene in terms of what sort of rest period we should aim for optimal grass yield and optimal quality of the pasture. Any one tiller, after it's been grazed, it puts up its first new leaf, second new leaf, and the third new leaf. But then as the fourth leaf starts to grow, that first leaf dies. So that first leaf dying is contributing to a reduced energy value of that pasture. If you remember a couple of slides back, the effect that has on land performance. And it represents, if nothing else, it represents a wasted feed opportunity. So the premise of rotational grazing as a standard, as a framework, and like I say, it's adapted to suit different people's needs, but it's to try and match the time that you come back to a paddock to coincide with this three-leaf stage. One of the sort of tragedies with this three-leaf rule is the first leaf is often greater in energy than the subsequent leaves. So under a set stock situation, sheep in particular will select out the first new leaf and continually put pressure on the plant. So a big sort of starting point, a big sort of a framework is to try and coincide the three-leaf stage to keep the grass short and leafy. So that's when we come to discuss rest. Now, rest, as we heard yesterday, I keep saying that, but it really does depend on grass growth, and it really should be a moving feast according to the conditions. But very generally, I mean, we heard James talk about 14 days rest period, but very generally in the spring, the rest can be from 14 to 21 days. In the summer, you'll extend out a bit more. In the autumn, and then in the winter, we're aiming for 90 to 100 days. If we look at this graph on the left here, you can see the disadvantage of grazing it too short. So if you're keeping the grass at the 3 to 4, grazing it constantly too short, below 3 to 4 centimetres, you're not allowing it to reach its full potential. And again, if you're leaving it too long, then the net production starts to decline because leaf death is increasing so much. So that's why trying to come into paddocks at the sort of 8 to 12 centimetres marks is great, because it allows the grass to achieve its full potential before it going beyond that point and going into leaf death. So very simply put, we are trying to use rotational grazing to tie in with leaf production. So if one leaf takes 5 days to grow in the spring, then we want a 15-day rest period. The other question people might ask is, what sort of grazing interval might I go for? And how long should I keep them on a paddock for? And of course, it's very much a balance between what's practical for yourselves and what's ideal. The less amount of time they have in a paddock, the less they're going to waste and the more they're going to utilise. So 1 day paddocks are fantastic if you really do want to drive utilisation and really get the maximum out of your grass. However, often people will compromise and go to sort of 3 days or beyond. The issue with going too far is gives the animals opportunity to graze the regrowth. So anything beyond sort of 5 days in the grazing season, then those animals can start grazing that first new leaf again. The best control that you have is with smaller paddocks or larger mobs. And we heard a lot yesterday. I mean, Kalina mentioned how she has reduced paddocks to less than around 2.5 hectares off memory, maybe less. And it's important to keep it practical. I mean, Tom emphasised how to make sure that you're not just moving fences all the time and substituting concentrates, etc., for labour, because that's a cost too. So as a little starting point, I often advocate a simple approach. I would say split fields up more, so from 2.5 to 4 hectares or 7 to 8 acres. And I quite like the approach of the 3-week, 3-day rotation. So with this, you allow the grass a 3-week rest period and you graze it for 3 days, then move. So a consequence of that is you have 8 paddocks. I think this is quite a nice starting point because it gives you opportunity to adapt, and that is critical. So as grass does get ahead, and it's likely with this rest period, there is opportunity to skip a paddock and take it for silage or otherwise. On the other side of the coin, if grass growth is too slow, then you'd have to bring in more areas, bring in more paddocks to increase that rest period. I've taken this table from a Farm Advisory Service publication about rotational grazing, and it just gives a bit of an indication, again, a guide. I've underlined here guide, and I know people always do different things, but it's a starting point of sort of group sizes, stocking rates, etc. for different classes of stock. We heard the farmers talk yesterday about different mob sizes, and that's very much as it's dependent on what your sort of handling capability is. What's your handling system? What can the team handle? Because if you're bringing in, say, 500 ewes and twins at one time, you've got to be ready to dose 1,000 lambs in one go. So it's very much based on what you can handle. So just based on experience, these sort of group sizes, so based on farmer experience, these sort of group sizes seem to be a good starting point. And on that basis, I've given a bit of an indication as a conservative guide to stocking rates. It's based on a very conservative summer grass growth. And then with that, I can see what sort of area might be required for the different classes of stock and what sort of paddock size should be required based on the 3-week, 3-day system. So this could work as a nice starting point for those looking for some facts and figures. What I think is really useful as measures as to whether you've got it right is measuring the grass height on entry. If you're constantly exceeding these 8 to 10 centimetres mark, well, that's an indication that the grass is growing faster than you're going round. Therefore, you would benefit from what you call shortening the rotation by taking a paddock out. If the grass is not reaching the 8 to 10 centimetres mark, then you'd benefit from increasing that rest period, perhaps bringing more paddocks in. And then in the final column, we talk about the target grass height on exit, which is otherwise known as the residual. And again, this ranges from 4 to 5 centimetres. What I would say for stock that I want to keep growing, that are priority stock, don't graze them below 5 centimetres, because as soon as you start to graze them too low, then they're being forced to graze the poorer quality stuff at the base of the sward. If I've got some dry stock or stock with lower demand, then I might graze them that bit tighter to improve the quality. So in starting the rotation in the spring, it can be quite a challenge. The reason is if you start on one paddock in the rotation, you know, by the time you get to the last paddock in the rotation, the risk is that the grass might have gone rank. The ideal situation as the rotation gets going is you get this this grass wedge. Now this is taken from a tool called AgriNet, which shows the paddocks in order of their height. And a grass wedge basically means that you've got the paddocks organised according to their pattern in the rotation. So I can see this in this example, they're going to go to paddock, well, 1 or 2 next. They might skip paddock 1 as it's exceeding the demand line. Often people will start with cattle. They'll have to start the rotation out of the shed. And then with lambing, it would be a case of grouping up the ewes and lambs about a month post lambing. The Irish sort of coined the term, I think it came from Ireland, is magic day. And magic day is when the grass is getting ahead of the animals. Basically, it's suggesting supply is ahead of animal demand. So when you start to see the grass getting ahead of animals, it's an indication that these animals, whether they be ewes and lambs or the cattle in the shed, they can start to be grouped up into their rotational grazing groups. So they might be across the whole rotational grazing area to start with, and they might be grouped up, ready to go into their rotation in their paddocks. Some might consider drift lambing, so where you move the ewes and lambs out of their lambing paddocks and leave the ones that are still lambing there. And that's a great approach because it keeps the lambs in batches of their ages, and also it means you can prioritize good quality to those ewes in early lactation. However, it comes at the disadvantage of disturbing the ewes while they're lambing. Ewes into lactation, I mean, I put 4 to 6 centimeters they should be going on to. They should be grazing above, I should say. If they're singles, yeah, to 4 centimeters, and if they're twins, to 5. We've talked about or mentioned yesterday the sort of leader-follower approach, perhaps, where the sort of priority stock are out in front. I think James had a very good example, and they had the cows grazing behind. Cows are really good at tidying up pasture, where the ewes and lambs are going to be very sensitive to poor pasture quality. All the farmers mentioned an early March rotation, and I like the way Kalina likened it to mowing the grass. As soon as you start mowing the grass, you have to mow the grass. So an early March rotation, grazing off that wintered dormant leaf, stimulates more grass growth and can lead to greater spring grass production. So it's quite a nice approach. But as with all of this, it's really important to be flexible according to the grass growing conditions. Here are the sorts of corrections. So if there's too much grass, if you're above target, it's important not to just chase the grass. It's important to tighten the rotation strategically by taking a paddock out. Because if you continually try to forgo your target pasture height on exit, if you're continually leaving more and more, then you're going to lose quality. The best solution, if there's too much grass, is to try and bring in more stock to take that up, or use a follower group to clean up. Topping, I mean, it is still useful. I know it's not ideal because you're having to expend fuel and time, but it's still a useful tool to maintain quality, particularly when you're getting started and you don't want to overcomplicate things with other classes of stock. If you want to keep things simple, a topping can be a really good tool as you get started. And deferred grazing, if you've got plenty of silage in the store and there's no additional value of keeping more silage, you can take a paddock out and leave it as a standing hay and just make sure you maintain quality on the main rotation, and then you'll get back to that deferred grazed grass with perhaps dry ewes post-weaning or dry cows. On the other side of the coin, if the grass isn't keeping up, you can reduce demand, so reduce stocking on the rotation, sales, weaning. So if there's not enough grass and the ewes are losing too much condition, you're better off cutting out the ewe and wean that bit earlier, and then prioritising the grass for the growing stock. You might want to bring in additional paddocks. You might want to feed. Fertiliser can be a good tool. As we heard last year, in August, nitrogen was a really valuable tool for Kalina. And you can adjust the rotation. So lastly, just to say, spring grazing it is a tricky balance starting in the spring. And I think the tips yesterday provided by Tom, starting with weaned ewes, or even just starting with them if sheep, the class of stock that you run, winter grazing is a better way to start, because in the spring everything's happening at once. However, it's not insurmountable. In the future, starting in the autumn, by resetting the pasture quality with low demand stock. So if I've got dry ewes, perhaps grazing them that bit lower, it helps clean out the base of the sward so it gets away better in the spring. Staggering the field shut up, so those fields that I want to come to first in the spring should be closed off first in the autumn, and then I might have a bit of a wedge to go into the spring. Making sure you provide that rest period through the winter. Like I said in the rest period slides, over 90 days in the winter, ideal to make sure you build up the grass reserves. And consider looking at lambing and calving dates to match supply and demand. Are they well suited to your on-farm business? And I just wanted to leave it there. Thank you very much. And my final tip, I guess, for those that really do just want to get started, is to reiterate what James said yesterday. So splitting even fields in half as a starting point and switch them between the two. And then you'll see the benefits and become a grass nerd like the rest of us. Thank you.
That's great, Poppy. Thanks for talking through Daniel's slides there, and all the different things you've touched on with regarding managing grass and stocking ratio. And yeah, we've got quite a few questions now popping through, and we're going to deal with most of them after we've heard all of our speakers, but you'll be able to see them coming through just now. But allow me to just introduce Lorna Galloway. Lorna's based in the Stranraer office with SEC Consulting, an agronomist background, and a red meat enthusiast. And it's great to have her speaking today on grazing infrastructure. So over to you, Lorna.
Thanks, Jack. Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate Poppy's words that the bar was set pretty high last night. Kalina, Tom and James gave great insights into their businesses and how their journey with rotational grazing has progressed. But there was a clear message from all of the speakers, and that was infrastructure is at the centre of successful grass management and an easy life. You know, we want to enjoy rotational grazing, because when it's great, it's really great, and when it doesn't go well, it can be very frustrating. So tonight I'm going to talk through some of the considerations that need to be made when putting your infrastructure plans in place when you start out with rotational grazing. Farmers are a fairly creative kind of folk, and so my belief is that your grazing system doesn't need to be fancy and it doesn't need to be expensive as long as it's effective. So there will be many different ways to achieve the same thing, but tonight we're kind of just going to focus on some of the key principles. There we go. Where are we now? So Graze Grass offers the greatest opportunity to develop your farm business and through better use of an asset that you already have. Grass has the potential to make your business more profitable with a relatively low investment through achieving a lower cost of production, improving animal performance and increasing output. Never mind the environmental benefits of maximising our homegrown forage. Right now, we're facing a lot of unknowns and variables in farming, and looking at what the future might hold for agriculture, increasing our utilisation of grass to achieve a more profitable business is one of the ways that we can help control some of these unknowns going forward. But ultimately, what we want to do is achieve a higher utilisation of grass through a simple system, just to keep it simple. So the principle of making the most of our grass is to give it a rest, as Poppy described, going through the 3-leaf rule. Really, we want to make sure that the leaf has three leaves before it's being grazed off. So that ultimately means moving stock more frequently. So this can be achieved most simply by matching livestock numbers to the size of your fields if they're relatively small, but in most cases some temporary electric fencing will be needed to do this more effectively. So a good place to start is with a farm map. Google Maps, Rural Payments, Magic Maps, there's lots of different tools online that we can use now that will give us field sizes. You can play about with the measuring tools, so you don't necessarily need to go and get your trundle wheel out to design your system. So first place I would start would be mark out your existing infrastructure, such as where water troughs are, where's the water supply, is there any power currently to some fences, and then look at the topography and the soil types on your farm. So we want to identify where there might be wetter areas of the farm, where there's steeper fields, because you know when you're starting out, start with the easy option. Start with the fields that have already got some water in them, that they've got power to them, and aren't going to be as fragile, depending on their soil type. We also need to think about access routes to handling facilities. It would be fairly rare that you put stock out and they're not needing to be in once a month, whether it's for weighing or drenching, etc. So looking at how livestock flow around the farm and what gateways they prefer to come out of, and how you're going to get them to handle in yards, and as Poppy said, what you can cope with as a mob size needs to be considered. And finally, we need to consider the labour available on the farm and create a system which fits to it. So it might be that you're looking to go rotational grazing to decrease your labour requirements, or a lot of cases you'll have a job off farm, so it has to be nice and simple and easy and go to plan. So first steps, take stock of what is already there. And then there's really kind of three key elements: water, power, and fence lines. And definitely the most important one is water. It's critical to any grazing system, and it's critical even with housed animals. Given that the volume that falls out of the sky, it is quite ironic that water supply is usually the most common hurdle when we're implementing grazing plans, and you know, quite amazing that is the biggest challenge we have in getting it to where you want it to be. Water is essential for almost every bodily function in livestock, so restricted access to water will result in lower dry matter intakes and poorer live weight gains. So it is critical. Chugga's research shows that an animal will consume between 10 to 15 litres per 100 kilos of body weight per day, and demand is obviously higher with lactating livestock. So I've just put up oh no, I haven't moved the slide yet. I've just put up a slide there, just giving you an indication what the daily intake would be. So obviously sheep have got a lower requirement, and through the winter, many people who are grazing sheep through the winter would say that they really don't take a lot at all because of the kind of moisture in the grass. But as I said, it is essential, and they will not perform if they haven't got a source of clean, plentiful water. So when considering what equipment you're going to need for your water system, flow rate needs to be factored in. Flow rate will be influenced by your water source, whether there's water pumps in use, pipe size, and ballcock settings. So it's important to measure the distance that the pipes are going to be carrying your water, also if they're going to be carrying them uphill, as this will dictate the size of the troughs that you're going to need. Troughs can come in all shapes and sizes. They can be as creative and as cheap and cheerful as you like, but they should have a capacity for 5 to 7 litres of water per livestock unit. And if your flow rate is slow, then you'll need larger troughs just to bank up that water supply. The target flow rate would be 16 to 22 litres per minute, And just as a useless fact that might never come up in a pub quiz, adult cattle can drink up to 14 litres per minute. So you get a couple of beasts in there drinking at the same time, and they're not going to be long in emptying it. So stock also don't like to walk more than 250 metres, apparently, to get a drink. So keeping your paddocks smaller or having more water troughs will mean that they'll travel independently to drink, and that will reduce your pressure on the trough size and prevent bullying. Once the Chuggas did some work, and there's some work in America, that once they start traveling over this 250 metres, they tend to travel in groups, which is then obviously going to put more demand on that water supply at any one time. So mobile troughs can be a good way to get started on a budget, and the use of quick couplings, like are in the picture up here, are really useful because you can quickly plug in or unplug and move them on as you're moving livestock around your different paddocks. Similarly, the use of double troughs, the small one down in the corner here, as James said last night, about £58. So, you know, very reasonable, and they can straddle over paddocks, and they're not too crazy that you could you know, move them by straddling your wires. You probably be able to cover kind of 3 or 4 paddocks with those fences. So yeah, there's creative ways to do it, or if you're really limited, it takes a bit more labor, but you know, putting water out in IBCs, etc., can be done. So there's all sorts of weird and wonderful ways to get the water there, but the most important thing is that there's enough water and there's enough space, because stock with a thirst are usually unsettled, and that's usually when we see breakouts. So next on the top priority is power. Life is a lot easier when there is enough power on a fence to keep stock behind it. And you know, electric fences are psychological barriers, not physical barriers. So generally stock will learn pretty quick, as long as there's enough zaps coming out that fence. So the energizer required for your temporary or your permanent fence systems will depend on what power source you've got available. Can you plug it into the mains, or is it away from the kind of main steading, or you know, grazing away from farm, that you're going to need to look at solar or battery, and the distance of fence lines that need powered. So when comparing your energizers, they'll look at the boxes will display stored joules of energy and output joules of energy. Output energy is what the power that will actually get to the fence. So that's the figure that we look at when we're comparing energizers. So just a quick rule of thumb, remember that 1 joule of output energy will power approximately 6 miles of fence, subject to an earth system, vegetation on the fence, etc. But that gives you just a rough guide. But most boxes now will tell you on the box, you know, what kind of distance you would expect them to power. And there's a lot of good, reliable battery and solar energizers on the market now. So if power is not available, even if power is available, a solar option is good, reducing your power bill slightly. But remember the earth system, vegetation on the wires and the distance can affect the energizer's actual output to a fence. So probably go for something slightly bigger than you think you'll need, because inevitably you will increase your rotational grazing because you will become so taken on with it, and the difference that it's making to your grass management. And also consider, when you've got your map out and you're looking at where you want to get power to, just think about, is there areas that you could isolate when you're not grazing there, so that you can just take a bit of a pressure off that box. And very, very frequently I hear from clients that their energizers, their solar and their battery energizers aren't lasting. and they put them in the shed one winter, bring them out in the spring, and they're not going. So make sure and read the instructions on how to store your Energizer when it's not in use, and a wee bit of basic maintenance will go a long way. So as I mentioned, air systems are one of the kind of biggest impacts on how your Energizer works. So they're really the key to ensuring you've got sufficient power on a fence, and that it's going to provide the psychological barrier for the livestock that you want. Livestock will only receive a shock when the circuit is completed through the air system. So a very easy rule to remember is the 1, 2, 3. So number 1 meter of galvanized rod is needed for every joule of energy output from your Energizer. 2, your galvanized earth rod should be 2 meters long, buried in moist soils to almost the 2 meter depth. You'll need about 10 centimeters above ground to connect your earth cables to. And 3 earth rods should be at least 3 meters apart and connected through a continuous length of double insulated earth cable. So 1 meter per joule of output, 2 meter length of earth rod, and 3 meters apart. 1, 2, 3. Nice and simple. So as I'd mentioned, with temporary fencing, you're aiming to create a psychological barrier instead of a physical barrier. So there has to be that power there, because 4 little poly wires aren't going to deter a blacky ewe from going right through the middle of it. So the number of wires in your fence line will depend very much upon your stock classes and quite often breed. Cattle are fine with 1 wire, whilst sheep are probably going to need 3 or 4 until they've learned to respect those fences. And there'll be a bit of trial and error in finding out, what heights or work out for sheep. We find that with our blackies, we need 1 slightly higher and 1 slightly lower, because they would go up and over or burrow underneath. But they can be domesticated. And the more fence lines that you can put up in advance of your grazing period, the greater time saving. If you can effectively have your month's worth of paddocks set up, it becomes very, very simple to shift stock in between, and that is a bit more investment. But just when you're thinking about, should I spend this extra money and some extra reels, weigh that up against the time that you would spend taking some down to move them, to keep these paddocks going. And when thinking about when you've got your map out and you're looking at your fields, think about trying to keep your paddocks square-ish. If they're square, it helps reduce the distance that animals are needing to walk to get water. And research shows that square paddocks are often grazed more evenly than long, narrow paddocks. So I don't know many people with perfectly square fields, but in an ideal world, that's what we would endeavour in our plans. Equipment. So there's a variety, an endless list of different wires available for fence lines, whether it's poly wire, poly tape, poly rope. Poly wire, my preference is it's smaller, doesn't even get affected by weather damage if it's up through the winter. But different people have different preferences, so there's not really a right or wrong answer there. But when you are looking at it, look for one that's got more filament wires, as it's more conductive, and it's usually worth spending a little bit more on your wire just to get a kind of longer life out of it. Similarly with your reels, geared reels are absolutely worth the extra money, and higher quality reels. These reels, when you're moving them about, whether you're chucking them in the back of the bike or in the pickup, can take a bit of abuse. You want them to be robust and get a good life out of them. And plastic posts, pigtail posts, fiberglass posts, different heights. endless options. So there's no right or wrong option. It's just your personal preference and maybe budget. Plastic, the kind of cheaper plastic posts start at £1, and then you could be up to kind of £2.50 for a fiberglass one. So it's really, if you're just getting started, get started. You know, just get something that's going to get the job done. And spacing out for your posts, you'd usually be looking at 5 meters. So when you're kind of mapping things out and thinking about what quantities you're going to need, but this will depend on your livestock and topography. You know, if it's very hilly, if there's a lot of ups and downs, or whether it's fairly flat. And if you're starting out with stock that are fairly naive, you maybe put in a few more posts, as much just for something for them to see until they figure out that it's no worth the hurt in touching the fences. I wasn't really going to touch too much on laneways and roadways. Obviously, in a dairy situation, laneways are essential because you've got twice a day where you could have hundreds of cows needing to get into the stead, into the parlour, and they're going to chew up fields fairly quickly. But in a beef and sheep situation, you know, you may only actually be moving your stock off the paddocks into the stead once a month or so. So unless you've kind of got multiple groups of stock, and it would make it easier to fence off some laneways along fields, etc. They're not often essential, and I would say that they're probably a wee bit further down the priority list in the early days of your rotational grazing. The main thing is that you've got water, you've got power, and you've got plenty of fence lines. So I thought a picture would paint 1,000 words, and I would just talk through a very simple, cost-effective setup. So there's 2 fields here, southwest Scotland, just outside Stranraer. They're separated by a main road, which has you can see there's a kind of circular route. So there's a lot of dog walkers, there's a lot of people and horses, quite a lot of traffic along this road. So it's 11.67 hectares permanent grass on a 10-year lease. There's 1 mains water trough in each field, and there was no mains power. And the majority of the boundaries are in barb, so there wasn't really any plain wires to be tapping into. Stock and density, it's carrying 90 ewes through the winter, 140 ewes plus lambs, May to August. And the fields will get rested for 2 to 3 weeks in April, when the ewes are taken off to be lambed elsewhere. And ewes are then removed for about 6 weeks in September, August, September time, after lambs are weaned, and lambs would be left down there to finish. So in this situation, the paddocks are actually set up for use through the winter, October to March, and then they go on to, depending on a year, they would normally be set stock through the summer, but this year, because of the dry conditions, the paddocks were actually set up just to try and keep on top of the rapidly emerging seed heads. So I've had my best artist skills out here. So you can see there's a key down the right hand side here. There's the 2 mains water troughs, which were there to start with. The red dots are a gate, so sheep come out of this gate, down the road, and into this one. So to start off, to keep it simple, it was just split into 4 in the bottom field. It was actually nice and square, so there's 4 nice square paddocks, and top side kind of square, close enough. So for this, because there's no mains power, went with solar, and obviously, unfortunately, because of the road between them, there wasn't really going to be a practical way to use one energizer over the 2 fields. So there's 1 in each field, and they're positioned where they are to be out of sight from kind of walkers and whatnot, while still trying to capture as much light as possible. For the water system here, a temporary system laid out, so pipes laid along the fence line and 2 double troughs used. So there is the flexibility here that fields could be subdivided again. So there is enough water infrastructure there that these could be done and they would still cover the extra paddocks. Now, because of the high cost of the energizers here, the cost per hectare for the fencing was coming in £183, but that you'd be looking at that coming in about 120 with a more kind of run-of-the-mill solar energizer that wouldn't it's not just quite as high spec as these ones, and water was £56 per hectare. So it's difficult to give you a hard and fast rule on what you should expect your fencing materials to cost, because there's so many variables in what equipment you would need. But in this situation, it was £1.63 per metre of fencing materials, excluding the energizers. So you split that over 5 years, that's not a high cost for the stocking density that 25 acres is carrying. And the fields are can get quite wet. They're not ideal, perfect soil types, so that they are challenging. But that just gives you a demonstration of how you can, use the little existing infrastructure that's there, and make a paddock grazing system out of it, which is relatively, simple. In this situation, there's no gateways put in, so sheep just move around, and because they're blackies, we find that it's easier to fold the wires back to make a gateway, as opposed to James last night said that he can just pin down his wires and the sheep will jump over them. But we try not to encourage blackies to jump any more than they already do. So there's no bungee cords or anything. It's just that the ends, the joins, either the reels, there's a reel here, there's a reel there, and these are hook joiners, gate brake handles. They're just pulled back round to give a kind of a 12-foot gate effectively. So nothing too fancy about it. So sources of information, wide and varying ranges. I'm sure you're coming across it. YouTube Farm Advisory Service, EHDB, Farm and Water Scotland have got some great things on alternative watering. So where you're maybe just working with, it would have been a burn, how you can extract water out of there. Your local consultants and grazing groups. No one knows your farm or your livestock better than you, but having a grazing monitor or being part of a grazing group can help you accelerate your knowledge, but also your confidence in managing grass, because pretty much I would put quite a lot of money on it that you'll always find somebody who's come up against the same problem and found a solution, so can help you out with it, or they can console you that they've made that same mistake as well. So nothing better than speaking to some of your fellow farmers. And one thing that COVID has done for us is made us a lot better at using social media, and nights like tonight where you can connect with people not just within your own area. So I've come up with my top 5 tips from my own experience and travels around farms here and in New Zealand. So the first one is always carry a fence tester. It saves a lot of pain checking the fences are actually on, and just checking your fences regularly can help flag up if there's an issue with power. So you can maybe see the power dropping on the fence before it drops completely and there's a disaster. So carry a fence tester. Number 2 would be spend the extra money on geared reels. It's 3 times the speed and your arms will thank you for it. I've had situations where paddocks have been set up without reels. There was one in particular, it was 200 metres long, and it was just rolled off the cardboard reel that the poly wire came on, and that made for a long time rolling that back up. Third is get your water supply right. It's essential. It's essential to animal performance, but also thirsty livestock are not happy or thriving, and unhappy livestock usually try and break out. So keep supply up to them and you'll keep your performance up. And when you're weighing up how much to spend on infrastructure, weigh it up against the time that you're going to save and plan it out before you start. It may seem like a lot of money to start with, but by investing in those extra few reels and some extra posts to put up some extra paddocks, weigh that up against the time that you're going to save. And finally, keep it simple. Accept that you will make mistakes, but success is not repeating them, and that is part of the challenge, and maybe the enjoyment is that it's there's always new challenges each year, and the goal is always to do better than the last year. So thank you. That's mine. Hopefully you can take some useful tips out of there. But infrastructure, good infrastructure makes your life an awful lot easier. So keep that in mind when you're weighing it up against the investment.
That's great, Lorna. Thanks for talking us through those very practical tips and tricks with your slides. That was great. Learning quite a few things there myself. So I never knew about, did you say 14 litres is what a cow can drink per minute?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's mental. Yeah. So
you're gonna put a cow in a boat race any day, aren't you?
But yeah, there's a few more questions that have come in. Poppy's been quite good at answering them, so everyone should be able to see those answers publicly when they go through the question and answer tab. But the other ones that we'll come back to, we'll do it at the end. So Poppy's going to come and present her slides now, and we'll just hand over to her just now.
Hi again, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, we've kind of refrained from going too much into the rotational grazing jargon as to not scaring off people wishing to get started. In this presentation, I'm going to introduce the concepts of feed budgeting. I think you can go quite far before you get to this stage by keeping it simple, as we've discussed in the previous presentations. However, I think the benefit of measuring, monitoring and managing grass, it gives you a bit more time, so you can use this information to look out ahead if you see trouble or opportunity, and it gives you that time and also confidence to make decisions if you take these measurements. And also it can help you optimize your system. You optimize the stocking rates. It can help you optimize your enterprise ratios. So yes, you can keep it simple, and by all means, if you want to do that, ignore me for the next 10-15 minutes, but hopefully I can kind of persuade you to thinking a little bit more about treating grass as a feed resource, as a means to further refine your rotational grazing. So we quantify grass. I know we've talked a lot in centimetres previous to this, but when we start to go into feed budgeting, we need to quantify grass in terms of a kilo of dry matter. We use this sort of feed on the right quite precisely, and we should. It's expensive, but it's easier to do so because it has a low water content. It's around 80, concentrate feeds around 85-86% dry matter. So we can feed it quite precisely. When it comes to grass, we shouldn't use that as an excuse, but when it comes to grass, 80 to 85% of it is water. And yes, that is valuable, but it's the nutritional component that we are most concerned with, that we can compare with other feeds. And it's only when we start to quantify in kilos of dry matter that we can start to allocate it to animals. We can't say a ewe requires 1 centimetre of grass, but we can say she requires 1 kilo of grass, perhaps at certain times. So that's why we move the language a step further and talk in kilos of dry matter. There are a load of free resources and good resources out there to help with feed budgeting. It can get quite complicated. But this, I mean, the New Zealand Feed Smart is a really nice app I recommend, and it helps you understand the requirements and rotation. The QMS, they have ewe nutrition and cow nutrition timelines. Along the bottom, they have the sorts of kilos demand that the different classes of stock require. Also done by QMS, available on request, is the quick and simple grazing planner, which is quite nice because it helps understand the grazing area or the number of stock supportable on a grazing area by calculating their demand and supply. And then there's another spreadsheet that AHDB produced, which I'll talk through later on, which is quite nice too. So these sort of resources, they help determine what the animal requirements are. They help determine what sort of rotational grazing area they should be given, or what sort of stocking rate. And they help with predicting grass supply, particularly those such as this AHDB spreadsheet. And when, unfortunately, I can't reach the chat right now, but I will put some links to these resources in the chat. So when it comes to measuring grass, I mean, there will be different means that will come on the market into the future. We talk satellites, we talk drones, but predominantly we are measuring using plate meters or sward sticks. And when we're measuring grass, we want to work out the kilos of dry matter over a hectare. And it's only when we've got that information as we can work out whether the stocking rate is right and what sort of we can compare supply and demand, if you like. You will kind of get frustrated with some of these, particularly if you're a very detailed person, because the way of measuring, you know, if I walked across a field, even with a plate meter, and had a readout of what the grass supply was in that field, it would likely differ from the same measurement that Jack would take. So there is slight inconsistencies. It's quite a frustrating resource to measure precisely. It is. But really what it matters is consistency. So making sure it's the same person measuring grass and you're using a consistent approach. Because it's only when you get your eye in, you can compare, well, I measured this time last month. You have more confidence in the change from measurement to measurement. And I think the most valuable and starting point for grass measurements is monitoring the farm average cover. So this is a cover taken over, it could be just the grazing platform, but ideally it can be taken over sort of 50% or more of the farm, as long as it's representative and you are confident it captures the variation across the farm. And this is where I introduced this AHDB spreadsheet, which quite nicely allows you to kind of forecast the cover through the year, and also it factors in animal demand. So you have the grazing area, the grass growth rate, and there might be some forecast in there. It works out the animal intake per hectare. You might add in some supplements, so it deducts that to give you the net animal intake per hectare. And then from that information, it can predict ahead what the grass covers are going to be. It's quite nice and simple. It's not 100% inclusive of the complexity of grass growth, but it's quite a nice approach for starters. So for instance, if I have looked at and measured grass and I have put my sort of animal details into the spreadsheet, and it's predicting my covers to fall as shown in this graph here, you want to keep them sort of in a target range, often around sort of 15 or 1200 and above, and not too high as well, because if the average covers are too high, you're going to run into quality issues. If they're too low, you're going to run into feed supply issues. So if in this instance the grass covers are declining quite steeply into the future, and then that gives me a nice indication that I'm going to need to do something about it. And so what I might do is think, right, well, I'll apply some nitrogen, or I will give a bit of quick feed to my lambs and sell lambs a bit sooner. And you can play around and look at what you might do in order to prevent this issue into the future. And that's what I mean by the opportunity of measuring grass as a means to predict and give you time to make these important decisions. And with time, these measurements become more meaningful to you. So at the start, it might be the case, I've measured the grass, it's 2,000 kilos of dry matter per hectare, note it down, and it might only be even a few months or even a year down the line that it starts to build up that history and have more meaning to you, because you start to think, right, well, I know this time last year, my farm was at 2,000 farm average cover, and spring started to get really tight. So this year, as I'm lower than that, I might need to start thinking what I need to do. So very much that history helps improve the meaning of these figures over time. Sorry, I didn't mention the silo here, but this is what I think is a farm average cover. It's akin to your silo. It's an indication of your pasture bank, what you've got there. Alongside that, you might think about monitoring grass growth. And this helps with these predictions. If you notice in the spreadsheet, the top line of the spreadsheet asks you to sort of predict grass growth. So with time, you can build up a record of grass growth. And of course, you'll say to me, well, grass growth is so variable. And what's the value in monitoring it and trying to plan for grass growth? Well, this is a farm, I think they are online tonight, the Nellises at Thistleyhoff in Northumberland, and they're the farmers that I know that have measured grass the longest, from 2013. And I think this is a really nice graph because it shows, so each one of these lines is the grass growth for a particular year. We've got, and in the shade, it's the range there. And yes, absolutely, it reinforces the fact that grass growth is so variable come spring and through the summer. But what's nice to see is that the range is actually quite tight through until early spring and in the autumn to winter time. So for starters, I can plan grass growth through these shoulder and winter months with a little bit more confidence. Where it gets more variable, well, I can use a mean of that to predict ahead, because there's no point me using a high grass growth figure for my future predictions, because the likelihood of that happening again is slim. And similarly for a low grass growth figure, but using an average helps me meet in the middle, and I can be flexible and adapt from there. So that's some elements of feed budgeting. When it comes to sort of the flock and the paddock scale, I've just thought I'd step out some examples of how to use it. So I've started with an easy example in the winter. Winter is a great time to start because we can have, like I said, we can have a fair bit of confidence in what the grass growth is going to do. And that's quite a nice route in to rotational grazing if you with sheep, certainly. So in this example, I've got 100 ewes, they're on 10 hectares. In this example, I've looked at the resources, which I will share with you. They require 1 kilo of dry matter per day. The starting cover, measured with the plate meter, is 2,500. My target at the end is 1,500. So therefore, I've got a total of 10 tons of feed. I'll just stop and take a minute. Like, for many of you, it might be the first time to consider the feed quantity of grass in a similar way that you might consider the silage in the pit and feed in store. So that's 10 tons of feed I've got available on that 10 hectares. I've now quantified it. I also need to be realistic. They're not going to eat 10 tons. I'll need to reduce some for wastage. So if I'm doing quite well with rotational grazing, I might say I'm wasting only 20%. If I'm not moving them frequently enough, I might increase that wastage figure. So therefore, 8 tons divided by their requirements per day tells me in that 10 hectares, I've got 80 days of feed available for that flock. On the other side of the coin, I might look at a summer scenario, so for cows and calves. And again, I've looked at the references and they require 13 kilos of dry matter per day. and they're on a 21-day rotation. Grass growth, I've either measured it or I've looked at the grass check figures local to me, but the grass growth I estimate is 25 kilos of dry matter per day. So for the demand, they require 520 kilos of dry matter per day, or nearly 11 tons over 21 days. The predicted grass grown over 21 days will be 525. I'll deduct my wastage, and therefore my total required is 26 hectares. And this could be quite a nice starting point if you want to be quite conservative with your grazing over the summer. It can be quite a nice starting point because it's a very conservative grass growth. So just to put some figures on paper as examples. Finally, I just wanted to show the opportunity with grass measuring and monitoring to be more strategic with farm businesses and really optimize the matching of feed supply and demand for greater profitability. So I'm just going to showcase this is a company I used to work for called Farmax in New Zealand, and what the Farmax, so Farmax provides the software, and what the software does is it takes your pasture cover measurements, it takes your stocking information and what their demand is, any other feeds being fed, and it effectively models supply and demand through the year in a similar way to the AHDV spreadsheet, but it's more sophisticated in that things like the pasture growth, if it's grazed too laxly or grazed too tightly, it will model how the pasture responds to the grazing. On top of that biology, it also brings in economics. It brings in the price of fertilizer, it brings in the price of feeds, the stock price, the lamb price, the beef price. So you can start to look at which strategies will work biologically, but also which strategies will generate greater profit. So I might do a strategic model, which is where I take a base of the farm. So this is a representation of what my farm is in what I call a steady state situation, because I don't want to model 2020 because the likelihood of 2020 happening again is slim. So I need to model an average state of my farm. From that base, I can develop some strategic scenarios. How about I lamb later? How about I bring in a deer enterprise? And I ask the question, will this work on the farm biologically, supply and demand, and will it make more money? So I just thought I'd show an example farm of how it can be used. This again is modeling the farm average cover through the year, so based on supply and demand. And then alongside that, it's modeling the minimum cover you can get away with. So it's a reflection of demand off pasture. So the objective is to try and get these lines relatively close together to show that you're utilizing pasture well, and to prevent the grass getting too high, which will have an effect on quality, but also it means that the system isn't optimized. Alongside that, I can interrogate things like the full profit and loss for the farm. I can look at where the pasture is being grazed suboptimally. So this shows when some of it's been allowed to go to decay, or when there's been a loss of potential, when it's not been allowed to get to the 3-leaf stage, or it's been grazed beyond it's been grazed too laxly, and therefore growth has been suboptimal. So, for instance, I might ask the model, can I increase sheep 25%? And it tells me, no, I can't. Can I lamb a month later? That's feasible. How about if I finish the steers rather than sell them store? That's feasible. What about applying nitrogen for faster lamb growth and increasing lamb growth because there's more pasture through lactation? It tells me that's feasible. And then I could do as above and improve lamb weaning percentage. and tells me that's feasible. So I've got some examples that will work on my farm. The next question is which of those examples is going to be the most profitable, and I can compare. So this is my base file, so it's making £105 per hectare. My first one, if you remember, was increasing sheep. It was more profitable, but unfortunately it didn't work, so that's a no-go. And then it tells me my second example, which you can see at the top, lambing later, was the most profitable example to go with. And I can take it further. So I might bring a few of these strategic decisions together. So lambing later, applying maybe a bit of nitrogen in the spring, weaning ewes at 100 days, increasing pre-wean growth rates through improvements of pasture quality and quantity, closing off paddocks for deferred grazing, and thereby housing cattle a month later, wintering ewes on swedes, finishing steers, reseeding and increasing grass growth, and increasing the livestock numbers. So it's a whole host of things, and this is just an example of how I might optimize this farm system. And through that, I can see, well, first of all, I would have asked if it worked, and I can tell you it did, and I can see what effect that will have on my farm profitability. So that's just a very quick run through just to show how feed budgeting is useful to fine tune the farm management. And I just want to emphasize the value does become better with time. You start to get your eye in as to what sort of covers are healthy for your farm, and then also it kind of highlights and gives you red flags when you're falling below or above that healthy range. It can help with paddock planning. It can help with timely decisions within the season, and beyond that, it can help understand the farm strategies, the best farm strategies. So thank you very much.
Super, Poppy. Thanks for talking through your set of slides today. Yeah, those graphs are really powerful. I think seeing the average farm cover for the years from Thistlehaw and just quantifying grass as you would any other hard feed. I think it's really important to good farm management and yeah, making savings and making gains. So yeah, so we're at the stage now where you've heard all our different presentations, and now it's opening up to questions. So I'm just going to begin with two that are on here. So yeah, please fire through any other questions you have, and we'll get to them. So we have a question here about when would you say the critical spring period begins? Do you answer that first, Poppy? And
yeah, sorry, I was still in my mind of answering some of the other questions, but yeah, when does the spring period begin? Well, as you saw with the analysis of Thistlehaw, the grass growth is very variable in the spring, so it's very much dependent on the conditions of the year. So you're looking at when the grass is getting ahead of the animals. Like I say, the Irish call it magic day, and that magic day will change, year on year. Generally, I mean, depends on where you are in the country, but generally it'll be sort of April, April time. Very, very generally, risky to say.
A good way, Poppy, would be monitoring your soil temperatures is going to give you a good idea, if we're heading in the right direction, which you wouldn't say we have been in the last few weeks. And the T-sum is a good indicator as well. It's behind last year, kind of not unexpectedly, but a soil thermometer is a good way.
Yeah,
you'll start to see when that grass will be kicking into life.
Good. No, that answers that question. And then Adam's also mentioned about the 3-leaf rule with ryegrass. Mm-hmm. Does this apply to other species, or what's your thoughts on that?
I should have said, yeah, predominantly I'm talking ryegrass. I mean, it'll be applicable to other of the sown species, but it's ryegrass predominantly? I don't know. Lorna might be able to answer more precisely on things like Timothy. I think perhaps it's similar.
Yeah, not an awful lot of kind of data behind that one. With different kind of more native grasses, they've just got a different kind of growth curve. You know, Timothy is usually in the mixes because it starts growing earlier. It kind of grows in colder conditions. So they just have a slightly different growth pattern and not as productive as ryegrass. So that's really why we base our swards around that. I mean, Yorkshire fog, you're kind of looking at 40% of the yield. You know, there's quite a difference. So sorry, 80% of the yield and a 40% response to nitrogen. So yeah, we talk about ryegrass because it is the most productive species and it's easiest to follow. So
yeah,
that's great. It was mentioned in the open questions, but you know, coming off grass and staying on it, but other species, other legumes, is it the same kind of management or is it totally different? You know, mentioned yesterday of chicory, you know, plantain. Can we just explain this a bit more? I think that'd be good.
Yeah, I'm kicking myself because I do actually have a sword stick somewhere specifically for multi-species swords. But anyway, for these, you would have much longer height going in and out, I would say, than your standard ryegrass clover sword. I can't for the life of me think of the exact centimeters at the moment. I think it's around sort of 6 centimeters out and then maybe 12 or so. And I know James, if he's on the line, you can type into the chat. I bet he knows. But yeah, longer, I would say. And yeah, we were talking yesterday, chicory seems to require a little bit more of a rest than the others.
And again, they've just got a slightly, if you imagine the grass growth curve, they've just got a slightly different kind of peak to a ryegrass, but they definitely have to be rotationally grazed. They will not persist under a set stocked system. But the benefits of the herbs in these lays like chicory and plantain is they're taproot, they're miners. Those plants will pick up different nutrients in the soil so that they'll give you a kind of wider mineral balance, if you like, in that sward. But if it's a predominantly grass-based sward with a low percentage of kind of herbal lay, you would go with the grass as your guide to grazing. But where you're getting the majority of your chicory and plantain, you need to go with them, not the grass, as your guide.
So on the back of that then, if with different species in the swards growing at different growth rates, if no ryegrass is in your sward, which species would take priority for your decision making?
Whichever species is dominant, I guess. It's a really tricky question. I mean, if it's heavy like plantain, chicory type sward, it's similar principles. You might just leave it slightly longer rest period, but ideally you still rotationally graze them to make sure you make the most of these good quality crops, good quality forages.
And then I've just had a private message on the utilisation, Poppy. You'd mentioned, I think this is when you were with your HDB spreadsheet, you'd mentioned 80% for the utilisation for rotationally grazed grass. For set stocked, what would that be then? You'd said that was really good, you know, rotationally grazed 80% utilisation. So what would be a normal set stock or percentage?
The industry average, what we often quote is 50% for set stocking. You're giving animals opportunity to waste grass in a field. You're giving them opportunity to let it go lank and reject it. So that's the figure. It's really difficult to measure under a set stock situation because you're not measuring intakes. But that's the sort of figure we go with. And what's noticeable really is the fact that through rotational grazing, so if you increase it to 80%, so you're talking a 30% increase in utilization. Well, if you're seeing a 30% increase in your and your stocking capability, or you know, in terms of your kilos of live weight produced per hectare, well, that's a nice indication that you're improving your utilization.
Absolutely. There's quite a few questions coming in here with the kind of the infrastructure side. So question here, if you're shifting electric fencing units regularly and you're using 1 meter long earthing stakes instead of 2 meters, as are much easier to pull out and put in the ground, do you remember that for every 2 meter earth you need 2 times 1 meters? I suppose it's getting your, coming back to your, I think it's your 1, 2, 3 slide, Lorna, and maybe just if you could elaborate how that works when you're shifting these fences.
Yeah, so one for every joule of output in your energizer, you could go with a 1 meter of earth rod. Where you're going to be moving your energizer, if it's a battery one or a solar one, they tend to come with some kind of earth kit. And to be honest, if you find that you're getting enough output on your fence and it's not causing you issues with livestock going through it, don't look for trouble that isn't there. But where you find that you know, and especially for mains units, which are generally powering greater distances, if you're struggling for the power on it, do an earth test. The Gallagher website gives you a great guide to that. So switch it off, put a metal load on the fence, and then switch it back on to see where you're if you're still getting output from the box. So yeah, if you haven't got a problem, great, don't worry about it. If you've got the output, keep it simple.
Yep. And then on the, sorry Poppy, you're going to come in there.
I was just saying, I've heard of people like burying like a galvanized gate as a means to earth, which is quite a nice approach. I just thought I'd throw that in.
Just finding a, generally when you're burying something that length, they're not going to come out of the ground that easily. So, if you're putting in a fairly permanent box, bury those earth rods in a wet bit and try not to have to move them. But with solar boxes that you're maybe moving, or your battery boxes, they will come with some kind of earth stake, and unless you're really having an issue with output, just keep going with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then on the fencing side, question here, can you put an earth rod on a traditional fence and then use it to earth the electric fence? Is that possible?
Yeah, so your earth system, there'll be, if you imagine this is your energizer box here, and it's a mains one, and then in the middle, it's going to be your earth system, and then the earth system will connect to your fence. So as long as you've got a plain wire, or a hot wire with insulators on your existing fence, you can connect that energizer through the earth system to the fence, but not if it's barb. So as long as there's a plain wire with insulators. I hope that answers that one.
Yep. Yeah, so there's kind of similar, but somebody's saying that they'd never heard of the 2 meter earth rods, and a company, Powered Pasture, doesn't seem to sell them. You said that you would answer this live,
there might even be a Powered Pasture representative on the line. I'm not sure if they want to comment.
Yeah, I see somebody's just put in, Pale and Speedrite. They supply the longer ones, but I mean, we use we've put in a few of the Clip-X galvanized ones, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a specific earth rod. I think Rutland do them as well. Maybe not just as long as 2 meters. That's hard going, putting 2 meters into Wigtonshire stony soils.
Great. On the is it worth investing in equipment for a quad bike to manage your fencing? So I think of food farmers and they might be seeing nods here, but what's your thoughts? Yeah.
Absolutely. If weigh it up against your time, but anything that makes your life easier. James gave a top tip about the Rutland 3 reels that are connected, and he's got a drill, wired up to roll them up. So yeah, absolutely. If it's going to make your life easier, go for it.
Great. There's a question just to do with modelling programs for farm deer. Now, here's a question that I can actually answer. I'm doing a thesis into modelling deer, and I'm using Farmax. So Farmax is for the UK. It's got that built in to look at all red meat, so beef, sheep, and deer. So that's a model that we can model deer quite successfully. Just coming back to rotational grazing, is rotational grazing more suited to lambing later, i.e. late in April or May, rather than the 3rd week of March start?
It's not specific to rotational grazing. Lambing later is useful if you want to maximise what you make from grass, because you're coinciding, aren't you, lactation, peak demand with with grass growing. I would say you can still, I mean, if you're lambing earlier, it's probably you can almost be better off in terms of managing grazing quality, actually, because say if you're lambing in a shed and then turning them out, they're given more opportunity to get ahead of the grass growth curve. So there are benefits, even. It doesn't necessarily tie to those lambing later, I would say. And I noticed on the lambing notes, the colleague Tim Geraghty's mentioning whether it's advantageous getting the fences up now and getting the ewes around the paddock, or setting stock in it now and having them ready post lambing. I would say, thinking back to the pre-lambing rotations that the guys were talking about yesterday, I would say, yeah, if you can get them grazed, get that winter dormant grass off as soon as you can. I don't know what your ground conditions are and the grass is looking like, but yeah, certainly in March if possible, and then set stock for lambing and then rotationally graze again. So just sticking on the lambing topic, but I'm sure other farmers might have comments on that too.
Good. And then I've got a message here from Paul. If you saved grass from late summer to be grazed in late winter by ewes before lambing, how does the nutritional quality of the grass change over the winter? So I think it's deferred grazing. What's the nutrition like on that?
This is a great question, because we have a talk on this tomorrow. Ag Research from New Zealand, Catherine Towser, is going to talk at their deferred grazing trials. But to answer you now, yes, the quality does deteriorate as you allow the grass to go to seed. You will have a reduction in grass quality for later on, and that's why we say utilise it with dry stock, that can still survive and maintain their condition on that. You wouldn't utilise it with finishing lambs and finishing cattle. I don't know if you want to add to that, Lorna.
Yeah, a leaf test, take a forage sample. That's the best way. That then you know what you're working with and what you need to supplement, because ewe nutrition through the winter and that lead up to lambing is critical, and it dictates really the rest of the year. If you enter lambing with suboptimal nutrition, it's just a whole world of problems. So take a forage sample, cheap to do, and good data to base the rest of your nutrition plans on.
Mm-hmm. And on the back of that, and then if you're starting a rotation for the first time and you're going to do it this spring and with your ewes that are due to lamb late April, would there be an advantage getting the fences set up now and getting the ewes round the paddocks, as in to get them used to the system?
Yeah, this is Tim Geraghty's question. Absolutely. And Lorna, would you like to comment on that? What are your thoughts? Should they graze beforehand?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, and you're just trying to balance, it's that nutrition. If they're lambing late April, you're a bit safer just now. You're not in that kind of critical month before lambing, where you want to, minimize stress. So getting them used to just being moved around that system is going to help with the stress on the ewes, but also, you can tailor their nutrition the closer you get. So
and it'll give you the lawnmower effect.
Yeah. We don't need any lawnmowers where I am just now. There's nothing to cut.
Mm-hmm. And Jan's made a helpful comment here on the deferred grazing being that it's still cheaper than silage. And yeah, I think we all agree with that, the stats speak for themselves. So, yeah, there's coming back just to the rods with your electric fencing. What's the benefit of it being galvanized over it just being a plain steel rod? Do you know that, Lorna?
Well, you don't get the conductivity, and it'll erode in the ground basically. So yeah.
That's good. That's really helpful. In terms of what's coming through in the chat, if I'd missed any, just if you two should be able to see it as well. I don't know if any of our farmers want to come in and put their hand up if they want to say anything of what's been said, but there's one question here on any tips on how to train naive animals in respect to electric fencing. Lorna, I don't know if you want to come in on that.
Well, I'll take that as we've managed to successfully domesticate blackies, so that's quite good going. Probably start with if they've been used to just wide open spaces or big fields, gradually make your field slightly smaller, but make sure you've got enough power on the fence. It has to be a deterrent, because once one goes through, they'll keep trying. So you need to give them a fairly hefty shock, but just maybe start with halving your field and then bringing it a bit closer, so they're getting used to seeing that fence and moving through it. And like I said, we find that actually opening up the fence lines to create a gateway works better than trying to get them to jump over the fence when you pin it down. So
yep, no, that's great, Lorna. That's useful practical advice. A question just coming in on setting up your electric fence across the corner of a fenced field. I'm not sure. Oh, sorry, Jan's answering somebody else's question here. They're all coming in too fast for me to read. So it's reading. Right. Well, until I'll work this out. Someone's put a question in on will this be made online. Poppy, I believe you put yesterday's meeting up on Twitter, and then you're also putting out, if individuals ask you via email, the link. I assume we'll be doing the same again.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So and for the rest of the week as well, this will be going up online. In terms of the question and answer box, I have no more that have come in just yet, and the chat box is just on the polywires here on setting it up. Lorna, you'd mentioned the different kind of wiring set up in your infrastructure. Is there one to avoid, or is it just like whatever's affordable at the time?
Or whatever you've got in your shed. Everybody has a slightly different preference. I mean, poly tape is usually used for horses so they can see it. You got all sorts of different colors of wires, and some people have theories that you use the orange stuff if you're going to get snow. So a good quality one with good conductivity so that you're getting the power through it. I think most people will be using poly wire and go on great with it. So different strokes for different folks.
No, that's great. So unless you two have anything, Poppy, you were going to cut you off there. Yeah.
No.
if there's any more questions, please email them through to us. It's just our names at sac.co.uk. So, and we can answer those questions with you on a one-to-one. Please join us again tomorrow for the science behind rotational grazing. It's going to be really good. We've got some top class speakers coming in for that as well, and we look forward to seeing you at that. But we welcome your comments, and for those that have joined, and we hope it's been worthwhile. And please, the feedback from this would be much appreciated. So when you get the survey link, it'd be great if you could fill it out. But thanks very much for your time, and thanks to our speakers again, Lorna, Galloway and Poppy, and wish you all a good evening, and we'll hopefully see you tomorrow night. Thank you.
Thank you.